Welcome to Podcetera. Each episode is a journey of discovery as we delve into topics that pique our curiosity and yours. We feature in-depth interviews with fascinating individuals who have extraordinary stories to share.
I'm Renee Lego.
And I'm Joelle Ludovich. And this
is Podcetera. James Morehead, author, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California. Welcome to Podcetera.
Excited to talk to both of you.
The earliest poetry is believed to have been recited or sung, employed as a way of remembering oral history, genealogy, and law. Some of the earliest poetry exists in the form of hymns and chants. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the longest, oldest poem in history. It's an ancient Babylonian poem about a mighty hero who tried to become immortal, and it explores universal themes of love, death, and life. As a contemporary steward of this age-old form, James, would you mind sharing with us one of your poems that you feel best encapsulates your unique style?
I'll read something from my third book, The Plague Doctor. Has nothing to do with the pandemic. It has to do with the cool image of plague doctors. I'm not going to read the title poem. I'm going to read a poem that I think captures the rich imagery that people have latched onto. And I think anyone who has been to the place I'm about to read that this poem's inspired by will immediately resonate with them. She is San Francisco in shades of pink and blue, a painted lady with combat boots and attitude. She wears sweatshirts in summer, chilled by salt-soaked fog spilling over evening tides. You might catch a glimpse of her rollerblading across the Golden Gate as you sail beneath suspended steel into Pacific swells. She is portraits in De Young, a cable car's clang, a skate punk sprayed in neon green who runs from bay to breakers or swirls around a rainbow flag on Market Street in June. She is San Francisco, spun with threads of sunset hues and wisps of endless dune.
I love that.
Love reading that poem. Never gets old.
It perfectly encapsulates San Francisco. It hits all the beats.
And I actually wrote that poem when I was waiting to see Billy Collins, who's a former Poet Laureate of the U.S., and he was speaking in San Francisco. And I was just walking around the city, downtown San Francisco, near the Civic Center, and I just picked up a vibe that the city was starting to feel more like itself. And then sitting in the audience, I started writing down, "She is San Francisco." I was reminded about why I think San Francisco is so cool. And then when I see trolley stuff online about San Francisco hellscape, I respond back with that poem. Because I think that captures what it really feels like, despite any big city's challenges. I tried to capture the reasons why people love it here.
It's a wonderful city. It's eclectic, it's fun, it has a unique energy to it, and you captured it.
And I did a separate poem about cable cars where I actually recorded it for a travel podcast on a cable car, which was one of the coolest experiences, where they called me and said, "Hey, can you record this poem on an actual cable car?" Which we did, which is pretty wild.
Is that in the same book?
That is actually in a book that I'm working on next, which is going to be a tour of San Francisco Bay Area museums through poetry. So I'm about 60% of the way done on that book. Hopefully next year it'll be ready to go. But yeah, I'm touring every San Francisco Bay Area museum, and where I see inspiration, I'm creating poetry to capture the vibe of the museum or artwork. So poetry is just such a versatile art form. I think that's why, from where you started, it has just been there all the time. Poetry has been a thread of communication and storytelling as far back as there was language.
When I was thinking about this interview and thinking about poetry, of course, I think about it in my own experience. And I don't think I've written a poem since maybe high school. But I feel like we all had sort of a poetry time, whether it was a teacher walking us through how to write a haiku, or we were love struck for a boy and we dabbled in poetry or our own or read it. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your upbringing and your early experiences and how that shaped your passion for poetry.
From a pretty young age, I was always into writing. My family tree has a lot of writers in it. And even though I went down a technology path, technologists are much more creative than they're given credit for. I think up till 10th grade, I had the typical high school perception of poetry is that it's hard, I don't get it, I feel dumb, I don't relate to it. And that has more to do with what's being taught than poetry itself, because I believe everybody loves poetry. They just may not have found the poetry that they love, or they may not think of it as poetry, even though poetry takes so many forms. In 10th grade, I was in a creative writing class, and the teacher introduced us to more contemporary poets. E. Cummings in particular really resonated because the style was so different than anything I'd seen, and it just sparked an interest. And when my first book came out several years ago, I tracked him down. He's retired, this teacher from way back in high school, and sent him my first book, which obviously he was thrilled by. And I think that was the key thing. It was what was being taught sparked the interest. Because poetry is not one thing. It's not monolithic. It is extremely diverse art form that takes many different shapes. There's no one bucket you can put it into. So when I was introduced to a broader set of poets, I was like, oh my goodness, this is such an amazing creative art form. And at the time I was heavily coding and was a software engineer. And there was a lot of parallels between coding and poetry where you're seeking perfection and every word or line of code or element matters, and you're just trying to get it distilled to the essence in the most elegant way possible. So I found a lot of parallels, which may surprise people, between writing software and writing poetry, that they had more similarities than differences. So it all meshed, and from then I went gangbusters for decades, and then it was really only 4 years ago now that a friend of mine said, you know what, you should really publish your poetry as opposed to just sharing it with friends and family, and that kicked me into high gear.
Were you writing when we worked together?
Oh, for sure. But I was probably writing very sporadically, where I would wait. This is another key learning I had during the pandemic period. I would wait for inspiration. The urge to write poetry would build up, and then I would write a poem, and that could be months or a year between. And then I learned that, especially a quote from a Pixar screenwriter of soul, professional writer is someone who writes when they don't feel like it. I'm simplifying what he said, but the gist of it is correct. I remember there was one Christmas holiday where I decided I will write every single day, whether I feel like it or not. And then for months, I wrote every single day, and I'd go to sleep thinking, I don't know what the heck I'm going to write about tomorrow. But then I'd find something, and then you throw away a lot of it. But,
I was just going to ask.
So you throw away a lot of it.
How much of that?
Yeah, you throw away a lot of it. But waiting for inspiration, you'll generate really good things sporadically. Forcing yourself to write like professional writers do, you will find inspiration. So waiting for it is a highly unproductive way to write a lot of great poetry. So that was one key thing I learned. So now with all the stuff I'm doing that's poetry related, it is hard for me to write every day, but I'm way, way more productive than I was years ago. That was a major epiphany, is that I should start writing and inspiration will find you.
Joelle, did you write poetry when you were younger or have a poetry phase?
I did write poetry. I saved a lot of them. I even typed them out, I was so particular about typing them out and keeping them really. I still have them somewhere.
I still have some in a journal that I haven't thrown away. The journal's more musings than it is like a daily log of what happened in my high school years, because I don't want to relive that. But
most people don't.
Yeah, right.
In between, though, there's poems, and there was a
pain
boyfriend and pain and poems. There you go.
There you go.
Exactly.
I did my best writing when I was depressed and upset,
Poetry is such a compact art form that you can write a poem in the margins. It's pretty hard to write a novel in the margins of a textbook. And even from a performance point of view, I'm Poet Laureate of Dublin, California right now, and I can participate in an event and I'm only taking 90 seconds, and 90 seconds is more than enough to convey something powerfully through a poem. You wouldn't read a novel at an event like that. It's just not practical.
To me, poetry is a magical and artful manipulation of language. How would you describe poetry and what it means to you?
Poetry is an art form where there are very complex and constraining rules if you want to use them, and that's the form the poem needs to take. An example, I wrote a sestina recently as part of this museum project, and sestinas are extraordinarily constrained. You choose 6 words. Those 6 words are the last words in each stanza. They end in a specific order that you can't change. You can't modify the words. The last 3 lines has pairs of words in a specific order. So you're tightly constrained and you have to make this choice of these words. So all these rules. throwing all that out and just doing free verse where there is a structure. As a poet, you find a way to have structure, but that structure is not driven by some rule system that's been thrust on you. So I think that flexibility, and in the interviews I've done on the poetry podcast there was one poet in particular who was writing about lava flows in Iceland and took found text from Icelandic text, English and otherwise, and blacked out some of the letters and words so that the remaining letters created the poetry as though the lava had poured through the text to leave behind the poem, was sort of the visual image. So that's so unique, that particular way that she incorporated a technique of found poetry, but found a way to tie it to the subject matter. It's just poetry lets you do things like that are just so varied that I think that's what makes it such an incredible art form. So I think it's that combination of freedom, but not chaos or anarchy. There's some intersection between freedom, but it's not anarchy at the same time, was what makes poetry so unique.
Can you talk a little bit more about your day job and how you weave in and make room for creativity and poetry in your daily life?
My day job's a product manager in Silicon Valley, and that day job is intense. My kids are growing up now, which helps. Major caveat, if you have young kids, it changes everything. But my kids are growing up. I'm not good at doing nothing, so I need 100% outside of my 100%, and there's been different flavors of that. Writing, I think, will be my 100% outside of 100% until I'm not here anymore. It's such a passion. But, my day job is creative in a different way. I know that at work, they think it's really cool. Where I work, there's an active poetry scene. I can be open about it. There were some very famous poets from more the 50s, and maybe it was more the time period, that were, executives, professionals, and didn't share their poetry side at work at all. In fact, actively hid it. And it just wasn't viewed. Whereas at work, people know, oh, you're an author, you do this, that. They think it's really cool. And there's an open mics that I go to kind of once a month at work that has musicians. I'm one of the few poets that shows up, so they think that's cool. So I think that they're creative outlets, but different flavors of creativity get taxed. And that's definitely important to me. I need to have my creative itch scratched consistently, or I'm not quite happy.
I know what that's like for sure. Could you share with us a bit about your upbringing and how your early experiences or influences shaped your passion for poetry?
Well, unfortunately, I never met my dad's father, who passed away the year I was born. He met me briefly, but unfortunately passed away when I was born. But it turns out he wrote poetry every day, and his father wrote poetry, and his father's father wrote poetry. I didn't know any of that. I knew he was a writer, and he wrote for the New York Times and wrote some really good books on card games and stuff, but I didn't know he wrote poetry every day. My dad wrote a poem or two, but nothing like that. But my parents are both professional musicians. My dad is a lexicographer, so he inherited the family's business of editing dictionaries, thesauruses, and other reference books. Back in the day, if you ever had the Raje's Red Thesaurus, open the cover, that's my dad or grandfather are the editors of that. My dad is definitely a words person that was terrifying at crossword, Scrabble, and Boggle. I definitely grew up around literary and artistic people. I think that my parents as musicians, there was always a piece of me that was like, dang, I'd love to be that one on the stage. Acting was definitely not going to be my path to the stage. I did play the oboe for a bunch of years, but got pretty bad stage fright with that. And now, as I've taken some coaching and training around performing my poetry, I get to actually take the stage and perform these things that are so personal to me, and I thoroughly enjoy it. So I'm getting my artistic moment now.
It's fantastic. I may still have my thesaurus that you described somewhere.
That's pretty incredible. You were almost born to do this.
I may have
Yes. There you go. There's a revised edition prepared by Philip David Moorhead.
That's crazy.
And then this one, the Webster, this is also Albert and Lloyd Moorhead, my grandfather and grandmother, then edited by Philip Moorhead. So, yes.
Wow, that's incredible. Pretty neat. Did you used to write poems as a kid, and have you ever gone back to read them?
I really started writing poetry in grade 10. I don't remember. I probably did before grade 10, but not memorable at all. From grade 10, I got totally into it and started writing obsessively. And in fact, in my first book, I included 4 poems unedited from a book that I pulled together with classmates as a term project. That book was called Viewless Wings, which is a line from a Keats poem. And when I was setting up my website, miraculously, viewlesswings.com was available. So 40 years after I did this project in high school, and the first journal I edited was called Viewless Wings, that was available. So that's where my website name came from. But there were 4 poems I included in the appendix of my first book. I don't want to edit them because then they're not high school poems anymore, right? So I want to leave them as is, but they held up like they were. I was proud to include them in the book. And they captured definitely me as a teenager at that time. And I'm quite proud of them. But I have, everything I've written since 10th grade on, I have in some form or another. I used to write everything longhand, but it was during the pandemic when I couldn't sleep and I was, like many of us, stressed out, and I'd be waking up in the middle of the night worried about a million things. I would just get out my phone, put it in dark mode, Google Docs, and I started writing everything on my phone just for purely practical reasons. And now, because I'm doing that, I don't write longhand anymore. I just write on my phone, usually to get initial raw images down. I have a complete revision history of every poem I've written since a 2020 time frame, because Google Docs keeps your revision history. So I can go back and look at the evolution of my poems, which is really cool. Especially when I talk to student groups, I'll show them how much you grind away at a poem until it's ready enough to be out in the wild.
It would be interesting to have one page showing the initial beginnings of one and then its evolution into the final poem.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I published an article about an extreme example of that on my website about a month or two ago, where I went through and took screenshots of major points in the history of it and the edits, and it showed the dramatic change from the very first middle of the night, just sort of dump of what was in my brain and not worrying about what it would become, to the final version. It's a poem called Gallery, which went through months and months of edits, and there were periods where I was stuck and I just set it aside. And then the final version, a composer was really struck by it, and she wrote a 17-minute piece for baritone and piano that premiered at the Presidio Chapel, and it was actually on her most recent album. And that poem, there were points where I had pretty much thrown the towel and given up. And then I show that to students and say, this is how most poetry is. It's you grind at it for months and set it aside. And even though it's a short thing, in the end of the day, don't confuse short with easy to create.
Sometimes short is more difficult to create.
Totally. I don't know if it was, someone said, if I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. That quote's been attributed to a few people, but that's the gist. Yeah, it's totally true.
Good quote, or ish. James, you are the Poet Laureate of Dublin, California. What does that title mean to you personally and to the community of Dublin? And how does one become a Poet Laureate of a city?
So in the case of Dublin, at least, and I suspect it's similar for other cities, there's a process, with the exception of maybe, I think, at the California level or the U.S. Poet Laureate, who I had the amazing privilege to meet, Ada Limon, about a month ago. Amazing. It's an unpaid position. It's a voluntary position. But there's still a process where they have to be fair and equitable and transparent. And so they put out a call for a Poet Laureate. They hadn't had one for 10 years for a variety of reasons. I'm in my second term now, but I put in an application. Other people put in an application. They got down to a short list of 2 people. And then, amazingly, we were brought in front of the Heritage and Cultural Arts Committee, I think it was called. And the 2 finalists sat in the audience. We both got a chance to answer questions and recite a poem and talk about ourselves a bit. And then we sat in the audience while they debated which one of us was going to get chosen, right in front of us, because it's a public thing, so it's not done behind closed doors, which was entertaining. So I went through that twice. At the end of this year, my second term is up, and I'm going to hand it off to whoever else is interested. I think I will have established it. What does it mean to me? It's an opportunity to introduce people to poetry that, like I said, everybody loves poetry. They just may not have found the poetry they love. And so I found ways to do that. I run a roughly monthly open mic. The next one's next week, actually, at a local pizza place. I went to the pizza place and said, "What's your dead night?" And they said, "Wednesdays." I said, "Okay, we're going to do a poetry open mic." I think this will now be the 17th or 18th one we've done there. Usually half the poets at the open mic have never presented their poetry in public. And you get this diverse array of people from the community. So there's a lot of poets that poetry tends to be very personal and exposing. So there's a lot of people who write poetry but aren't comfortable sharing it. And then I also do in Poetry Month in April, I've done for 3 years in a row, a poetry walk where I do an open call for poets and I get 25 poems, usually 100 applicants. I get 25 storefronts, and then each storefront gets a different poetry poster, and then there's a map of all the places. So then people are going to stumble on poetry while they're doing other things. Then people share out their photos of them, and I see people just pausing. Again, a poem is not like reading a novel. You can pause for a minute and read a poem and be on your way and be affected in some way, which is what makes it such a powerful art form to slip into other places. The poem can be a way station on the way to a destination.
You've engaged in a lot of collaborations. I did read that you collaborated with an animator to bring your poetry to life in the form of an animated short and live musical pieces, since you brought that up. Maybe you could elaborate on a few of your collaborations and reflect on the significance of those collaborations to you and what impact it had on your poetry.
I love collaborating with other artists. So in the case of the animated short, I've done 2 poetry films, 1 video, 1 hand-drawn animated short. I've got over my other shoulder, but it's not visible, 6 of the frames of the 750 hand-drawn frames. So I was actually on Instagram and I stumbled on these beautiful hand-drawn animations. Turned out it was an animator director in Milan, Italy. This is during peak pandemic times. It was 2021 timeframe. And I reached out to her and asked if she wanted to collaborate. And I sent her 3 of my poems. I knew which one she was going to latch onto and choose, but I sent 3 to give the illusion of choice. And sure enough, she chose the one I suspected, a poem called Tethered, which is in my first book. It's about a bell buoy that I saw while walking in Marin with my wife along the coast of San Francisco, just north of San Francisco. I saw this little bell buoy and I imagined, what would it be like to have such an important job, but you're isolated? You know, what would it be like to be that bell buoy and going through all the seasons and being visited by seagulls and sharks and all these other things and the ships passing by? So I ended up creating a poem about that resonated. And then she took it and turned it into a story format, which was a conscious choice to be sort of different, a story format, hand-drawn animated short, a couple minutes. I submitted it to a whole bunch of film festivals. It won a bunch of awards. It did way better than any of us expected. And then I've also stumbled on a collaboration with a composer that my parents knew, and she said, hey, share your book. She latched on to this poem gallery and then just loved it and ran with it. That was unchanged from what it was. The city of Dublin, we have a big St. Patrick's Day festival because of the Irish connection between Dublin and California and Dublin, Ireland. I was asked to collaborate with a songwriter, and I wrote lyrics, which is the first time I've intentionally written lyrics to be set to music. I've had several poems set to music, but this was writing lyrics that would be turned into a song with an Irish songwriter who flew over for the event. So I love those collaborations. Do I ever write a opera libretta? Some poets have. That might exceed what I can do while I'm working full time, but I think that's probably out in the future too. I think there's just so many ways that poetry is meant to complement other art forms. It's not a standalone thing.
I was going to ask you about your process and revisions and things, but maybe you could take us through another poem and its evolution. So you told us about Tethered. Would love to hear about another poem and where the spark came from first, and then how long did it take you to get to that final verse?
All right. Well, I'm going to read the last poem in my third book, which has incredible artwork that's over my shoulder, too. This is hand-drawn by an incredible artist, Natalia Andrus, and it's hand-drawn ink art. So I provided her with the poem and the inspiring photo, which I'll talk about after I read the poem, and then she created this amazing artwork. I'll talk about how this poem evolved and where it started from after I read it. This one's a little darker than the San Francisco, which is the opposite of dark. When you perform my autopsy, be prepared, for hidden beneath the clean-shaven skin are gears, actuators, circuits, and optics. You'll find eyes made of glass that blink and dilate, perform the perfect wink, and when called for, even moisten with a tear. My fingers caress, dip cookies into milk, and delicately crack eggs just like yours. But each knuckle is titanium, not bone. And if you creep behind me on a carpeted floor, you'll hear motors whir as we walk in step. I had to be wired up, you see, because a momentary lapse in judgment took my body but spared my mind. But I'm a Potemkin village of a man, an illusion so real I haven't been outed for what I really am, an imposter, a shadow, an automaton with blood replaced by oil for hydraulic muscles, and my memory merely quantum sparks that will vanish when fusion's chain reaction ends. Perhaps that's why I lie awake each night, staring unblinking into darkness, having forgotten how to sleep, my mind racing at the speed of light, trying to solve the world's problems queued up to infinity.
Can you read the Potemkin line again?
Oh, yeah.
I love that.
Hold on, let me get back to that. Memorizing my poetry is in my future, but I haven't had the time to do that yet. But I'm a Potemkin village of a man, an illusion so real I haven't been outed for what I really am, an imposter, a shadow, an automaton.
I love that. I love that.
So this poem started with the most innocuous things. I was at a Walt Disney Imagineering exhibit at an art museum in Los Angeles, and there was an automaton head with the skin removed, so it had a nice creepy vibe. And I had gone down a kind of a more creepy vibe to this book than my first two books, and this is the creepiest of them all. And then I just thought, okay, there's something there. And I took a couple photos of it, and I didn't know what it was going to be. Then I started to lean into this imposter syndrome that, many people experience and feel, that you feel like, for me, coming out of the poetry closet, if you will, after decades of writing for friends and family and then going on stage and initially being pretty horrible at reciting my poetry and taking coaching and training to up my game to a point where I'm pretty proud of it now. You just feel like you're going to get exposed, and this automaton appears all real on the outside, but is, fears getting exposed, and this Potemkin village image and stuff like that. So that was what I started with this. I had this automaton physical thing that was an inspiring starting point, but I had no idea where the poem was going to go. And I think that's typical of most of my poetry. I don't know where it's going to end up. The poem will lead me to where it's going, and it usually goes to a point where it's an opening, not an ending. Poems, unlike novels, a novel with the beginning, middle, not end, pretty frustrating most of the time. But poetry should not be beginning, middle, full stop, end. It should be beginning, middle, opening.
The TV version of that is you get to season 3 and they cancel the show.
Oh, yes, exactly.
And they haven't filmed season 3 yet, or even the end of 2.
Yes, exactly.
Poetry has been described as a form of catharsis, allowing poets to confront their innermost thoughts and emotions. What does the act of writing poetry do for you? Is it healing, self-expression, or something else?
Most of the time, I think it's self-expression. I'm very privileged. I haven't had trauma like many poets that I've heard, but I have had some traumatic experiences. I was mugged at the age of 10 in Boston, taking the Green Line back from downtown Boston when I was in a boys' choir. And it was pretty scary. 10 kids surrounded me, put their hand over my mouth, were going to drag me underneath the underpass between the tracks. And then somebody, I don't know who, appeared when there was no one around at just the right point. And then a police officer sat with me the whole way home, and it was pretty hard. So then it took me a while to figure out how to capture that experience. So I wrote in my first book a poem called The Green Line. That poem's actually going to appear in a journal around the topic of bullying and trauma that someone reached out to me. So I actually ended up writing it in reverse order. So I start with me sitting next to the police officer on the Green Line trolley going home, and then work backwards to just leaving the church after choir practice. And then I think I had the final line was, it was a Wednesday, or something very innocuous. So you kind of unravel the story as you go. And once I did that, the poem sort of fell into place, but it was very tricky. It took years for me to figure out how to capture that experience where this is important to me. And I've seen this at open mics where there are poets that just get out their demons, but it's not really a poem at the end of the day. I think you still have to deliver a poetic experience. It can't just be a howl. A howl is a form of poetry. It's still a poem. There's still a craft involved. And I think that's something that makes it really tricky when you're dealing with things that are more traumatic in nature. And another experience that was not so much traumatic, but something everyone goes to, another poem I love to read about having this brutal crush as a teenager. And it took me a while to figure out how to capture that experience. And I ended up writing a poem called Crush, where I used the word crush in every different way imaginable. And that was the hook. I think that's another thing too, is that you'll find some hook format, something that ties it all together, and then the poem emerges from the page.
Are there any poets or literary influences that have or had a profound impact on your writing style?
I mentioned E. Cummings really, even though I think in my earlier poetry, I avoided capitalization and punctuation and really tried to be extreme free verse. I've since used all different forms of poetry. A.E. Stallings, who is an extraordinary craftsperson at formal poetry, sonnets and other forms of poetry. She would hide the form. You wouldn't see it until you read it a few times. Dana Joy, a former Poet Laureate of California, is like that. Olivia Gatwood, who's a poet who also has a wonderful novel that's coming out this summer. The way she has her performance of a poem and the poem on the page and how they're almost like two worlds. Safiel Hillo is another wonderful poet who writes novels in verse as part of what she does. So it's an entire book, but it uses poetic form throughout. I don't think I would write a novel. That's unlikely. I don't know if I want to write that many words down, but a novel in verse, I think would be, I've got some ideas percolating for that. So yeah, there's a number of poets. Since I do a poetry podcast, I'm getting introduced to all sorts of poets. One more example, Sean Singer is a poet who worked as a New York City cab driver for many years to pay the bills. And I think it was called Today in the Taxi, but he wrote a series of poems, which the first half was a little vignette from one of his real experiences. And the second half pivoted into one of three topical themes that connected the two together. It's a really amazing book. And they're so different. And I mentioned earlier, I think it's Katie Didden book that was this lava flowing through the words to leave behind the poem. Like, it's just, they're so different, each of these authors, and so many more that I've read.
Have you ever written a poem that challenged your own beliefs or forced you to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself or the world around you?
That's interesting. I think a type of poem that I rarely write are issue-based poems. And right now there are a lot of subjects in the world that are very traumatic that I have stayed away from, mainly because of my position of privilege, and I don't think I'm the voice. I've written a few, though. One from my next book that hasn't been published yet, but I'm sure it's going to find a home, that I wrote inspired by the Beat Museum in San Francisco. And in visiting the Beat Museum, I was really struck by the attempts to ban the poem Howl by Allen Ginsberg, and how that, as it always does, backfired. So a book that probably would have been poem and books that probably nobody would have heard of has sold 1 million copies since because of the publicity surrounding it. So I wrote a whole poem about the Howl trial, where he ended up, well, not him, but the City Lights bookstore and Lawrence Ferlinghetti won this freedom of speech case. And still now there's this book banning is just bubbles its ugly head up from time to time. And so I wrote a poem that even when I recite it, people go, "Oh, that's an angry poem." I said, "Yeah, that's not my style really, but there are a few things where I feel like I can do so without it being this privileged person having something to say." So I think that one in particular, I found a way to express my outrage but retain the poetry. So I'm quite proud of that poem. At some point it'll find the home. As a poet, you realistically have to be very patient in finding homes for things, because I've had some things that were rejected. I just had one that was rejected like 15 times and won first place with a cash prize in the Havoc Journal at the Las Positas College. And so at a certain time, poems find their homes. So I think, yeah, leaning into something where I'm angry about something, finding a way to write about those, really tricky. I think in terms of learning about myself, again, I had a pretty middle-class, happy upbringing. I don't have some deep, dark thing that I have to expel through poetry. Other than that experience of being mugged, I think that was one where I was able to externalize. And maybe, there was one poem I wrote about bullying that just got placed. Actually, I was pretty bullied in middle school. And I think writing about those things does externalize and makes it more, take something that happened to you, but you put it on the page and then you're analyzing and dissecting it as poetry. And that can be, I think it's quite therapeutic, where it gets it out of you and puts it on the page and you're looking at it from a third party's perspective. So I do think it is therapeutic to write down experiences and externalize them rather than have them rattle in your head.
Have you ever been asked to write a poem that maybe you weren't comfortable writing?
I've had to do a couple of memorial poems. So my mom's sister, who was paranoid schizophrenic, passed away a number of years ago. And then my wife's father passed away a year or so ago. And then I was asked to write a poem for the service, and then you've only got a week and it's got to be just right. So those are tough. And then reciting them and not having your emotions, you don't want to totally block that off, but you want people to not get in the way of it too. So those are kind of sad examples. As Poet Laureate, I've I was asked to write a poem for the opening of a park, and I felt, oh, now I'm really a poet laureate because I've done a park opening. But now that I've done a park opening poem, so then trying to find a way to write that poem that will still be poetry was tricky. Although then, just like with my San Francisco poem, we've got a pretty diverse, very diverse population in the city that I'm in California, an extension of Silicon Valley, and a large Asian, East Asian, South Asian community. And so I sprinkled in little Easter eggs, and I had one child come up to me and was, I'd mentioned cricket, and that, boom, that's the word that he heard. And I'm like, okay, good, I'm doing my job. Because I'm not a very diverse person, which is obvious from looking at me at least in North America, I'm not. I'm conscious in my poet laureate role to try to find ways to be inclusive and true to the poetry. Oh, the other thing I was asked to do, which I think was one of the coolest things, was for the city of Dublin. They were putting in 6 statues in their heritage park and museums. They asked me to write captions for it. They said, we're not looking for poetry, just captions, but you can't take the poetry out of a poet. So I wrote it as 6 prose poem stanzas. And then a year later, they'd been installed, and I went and looked at them, and my words had not been changed at all. And the 6 stanzas were designed to be one poem or work as individual stanzas. And then they're all stamped into steel, stenciled through, so they're not going anywhere. So that's one of the coolest poet laureate things. My words are going to last as long as those statues last.
That's very cool.
How do you see poetry, photography, and other art forms contributing to conversations about empathy, social change, and the human experience? Something that's needed in today's world.
That's a great question. It's actually something I want to write about at some point. So I've interviewed a couple of poets for my podcast who have written about history using poetry. Heather Barbeau wrote a wonderful book called Monarch, and it's a history of 4 Western states through poetry, and the histories are pretty ugly. That ugliness could be lost in a textbook filled with dates to memorize and paragraphs of text to read that's super dry, as opposed to poetry has to get to the essence of the emotion. It has to be things that really strike you, and there's no extraneous anything. And so I think poetry should be used to teach history, not 500-page textbooks. I think 500-page textbooks maybe play a role for some things, but not in high school. I think it's just a way to make people hate history. Whereas these 3 books, one was another one about the Middle Passage and slavery in the U.S., and it just brings those histories to life in a visceral way, in a way that poets are just designed to do. Their mind is to pull out of that the most visceral, impactful, image-rich, slight, simple, targeted. Poem doesn't have room for extraneous anything. Poetry plays a very powerful role because it's so compact. You can have a poem that lasts a minute or 2, or 5 or 7, Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem that had such an impact, just blew people away. It's just an art form that everyone has a minute or 2 to read a poem or listen to a poem like that. That makes such a huge difference. So I wish it was used as a teaching tool for history in particular. I think that would be a very valuable, powerful way to get students more engaged.
Amanda Gorman, as talented as she is now, can you imagine her 20 years from now?
Oh, goodness.
What she's going to produce?
Her first full book, amazing book, uses all sorts of forms of found poetry, concrete poetry. It's just an amazing first book. So yeah, her upside potential is amazing. And the fact that she's able to do that with so little life experience to draw from is incredible, because I think even Margaret Atwood, whose most recent poetry book was really good, she said in an interview she wasn't totally in love with her earliest books because as you get more life experience, for most writers, they get stronger because they have more to draw from. That's why the poetry that AI generates, and AI is a useful research tool and definitely has utility, but as far as writing poetry, it's horrible. They're horrible. At best, it will impersonate the melange of sources, but there's no soul there. So yeah, I'm not worried about AI writing poetry that competes with me. I mean,
it'll steal your poetry instead.
But it won't be able to do anything with it. It won't be able to really do anything with it. I think, at least for poetry, they are so far away from having a soul that, yeah. So I think that life experience builds up and it gives you this pool of experiences, emotions, images, sounds, smells, everything to draw from, in addition to whatever is the inspiration at any moment in time.
How do you envision the role of poetry evolving in the digital age, especially considering AI?
Poets do a ton of research for their poetry. So I'll give you an example where I found AI quite helpful. Part of this museum book project, I was at the Oakland Museum of California, and there in one of the galleries, there was this portrait of a very posh looking woman from the 1870s or so. And the frame was this incredibly ornate, elaborate frame. And I thought, the poem is about the frame. The portrait is the inconsequential part. Although I did research, who is this person? There was a little caption, so I dug into it. So then I used AI to ask, what type of wood would have been used for an ornate portrait done in the 1870s or whatever the time period was, and why? And I got this answer that said, well, at that time, it would have most likely been XYZ because that would have been readily available and it had the durability to last for years and it would have been used by wood. So it was like, okay, now I wouldn't fact check that because you can't 100% trust. It was an answer that, unless someone had written in an article very specifically about that, it was more an amalgam of the training data. So that was actually quite helpful. I've also done things like for this next book, I was doing a poem about an Asian art museum display of Sumatran swords. That one I think it was the villanelle? I don't remember. Anyways, that had a formal form of poetry where there's rhyming. And I was saying, give me some rhymes, words that rhyme with this that are related to swords. Now, I could have figured that out by trudging through a thesaurus, which is very useful in some situations. But in this situation, it was really cool to have ideas that were contextual in nature. So that was handy. And I'd say the last thing that I use AI for is I work with a poetry coach every month or two who's a wonderful USC screenwriting grad who performs poetry. And I will, every couple months, I will set up an hour and pay him to critique 2 or 3 poems. I can't meet with him every month, every week. I can use an AI tool to say, here's my poem, with the memory turned off so it doesn't retain it. Here's my poem, and here's a prompt that says, I want you to critique it as though you were an MFA professor. And then I get, on a scale of 1 to 5, like a 2.5 level critique. And it's quite handy because it's 24/7. You just got to view AI as a tool. As far as writing poetry, zero value. Like actually writing the poems, I would never use it for that. It gives you, I do it occasionally. I'll say, what do you suggest I replace this with? So yeah, I don't think it's an either or with AI, good or bad. I think it's a tool like anything else. And some of the uses of the tool are good. Some of the uses of the tool aren't so good. And then there are side effects that we have to work through.
I just went to ChatGPT just for an experiment.
Okay.
I typed in, write a poem in the style of James Morehead, Poet Laureate.
Oh, so fun with...
I've probably tried that before. It was pretty horrible.
Yeah, the title of your poem is Echoes of the Firefly.
I already hate it.
I'm going to email it to you.
Okay.
You don't have to read it here, but this is kind of funny experiment. And I wanted to see, since we were talking about
There's some of my poetry that is out on the web and crawlable, mostly not. But yeah, it's there wouldn't be a ton of training data for it to do it. Yeah.
Echoes of Firefly, and I want you to take a look. It's coming through right now in your Gmail.
Hold on, I will take a look at it.
I could tell ChatGPT do a better job if you want.
Oh, there we go. All right. Let's see what... Oh, my God. I wander fields where whispers waltz with wind. Oh, my Lord. Yeah.
Such alliteration.
Yeah. It's poetry technically, but oh, my goodness. It's just missing that thing. It's soulless, and it's also stuff that comes across as pretty cliched.
Yeah.
It's just because it's an amalgam of training data that takes the uniqueness away and smushes it all together, which for certain things is like my example of the gilded frame. And it's like, okay, there's bits of data around this question of what type of wood was used to make the frame that's in probably multiple places, and that mushing together is really helpful. But in other things like poetry, it takes all the color and turns it into blobs of gray,
It takes the fun out of writing.
All those things. Yeah, I mean, what's the point of asking a prompt to write a poem for you? It's like it's that months of challenge and pain. I wrote a poem that I can't be specific about because it's a pretty significant competition. I don't want to jinx it, but it took me months and months. And at a certain point, every night I was doing an iteration and reading it out to my wife in bed until she was sick of it. Halfway through, I thought, I won't be able to submit. I won't submit it if I'm not proud of it. And then a week ago, it finally started to come together. But after months of just wrestling with this excruciatingly hard poem, that if selected, it will be read in front of thousands of students. So we'll find out later this year. But I'm proud of it regardless. But yeah, that would have been I would never have used an AI tool to write it. But even if I had, it would have been crap. It would have guaranteed not to be selected.
Poetry has been described as a form of emotional alchemy, transforming raw emotions into artful expressions. Can you share a particularly powerful or transformative experience where poetry served as a means of catharsis or self-discovery for you? What discoveries have you made about yourself through your poetry?
I think my second book is anchored on a long poem that I wrote, and it captures my experience traveling through the Soviet Union as a teenager. It was pre-perestroika. It was hardcore Soviet Union. It was 18 days, no more than a day or two in each city. And I wrote that poem 5 years later in university, taking a creative writing course. So I had pretty much nothing other than my memories. And I started writing this series of poems, and it was like 24 or 25 that make up this long poem. I would just lie at night writing longhand at the time, my eyes closed, trying to replay this trip in my mind and figuring out what order it was. I didn't have any of the itinerary anymore, so I had nothing to go on but my memories. And it was remarkable what happened. Like, it brought back the trip. And writing poetry requires you to tap into these emotions, images, sounds, feelings, everything, and then figure out how to translate that into words. But it has to start with you feeling it in some way that it's visceral enough that you can describe it in a poetic way. So I relived the whole trip over the course of several months. In my first book, I included 4 or 5 of these Soviet Union trip poems. And I had multiple readers say, are there more of those Russia poems? So then my second book, I made it a series of memoir poems where they're all drawn from my own experience, very different from my third book, which mostly isn't. And I anchored it on that poem, which is called Portraits of Red and Gray, and that's the middle book there. And then the cover artist found a lithograph of the Kremlin that was created in 1983, the year that I was there, coincidentally. And it just worked perfectly as the cover of the book. So that was like really reliving that experience, which is a very powerful experience. Soviet Union, for the record, not a good thing. That's not something we want to return. And even as a teenager, I was definitely struck by what a strange dystopian reality the Soviet Union is. And reliving that 5 years older, I was really struck by that. So I didn't try to directly imbue the poem with any kind of message other than to let the experiences that I have give the reader a walk away of, we don't want this. This is not good. But I didn't want to say that explicitly. I don't think poems that pound you over the head with things are usually the right way to go. It took this incredible experience and it put it in a place where I can look at it and really appreciate it.
We're going to go into our speed round now, but before we do, I'd like you to tell the listeners how they can get in touch with you and find your books.
Just Google James Morehead, 1 O in Moorhead, just like it sounds, Mordhead. You can also go to my website, Viewless Wings. It's an easy word, but it's unusual. So V as in Victor, IEWLES Wings. Viewless Wings. It's a line from Keats. Those are the 2 ways you can find me. I've got a YouTube channel, Threads, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all the usual places, and a website. And on my website, there are links to the articles of all the amazing poets I've interviewed, as well as the poetry podcast that I do roughly monthly is on all the major streaming platforms where I interview poets, and also about once a month have submitted poems from mainly unpublished authors that I showcase their work.
Name one poem you wish you'd written.
I think a poem by Billy Collins. I believe it's called The Lanyard. I might be getting the title wrong. I think it's stylistically closer to me than anything else. And it's just such a beautiful poem that I think he loves to read that gets a really good response from audiences. It tackles into a very simple thing that's core and emotional. I won't give it away. It's better just to go seek it out. I believe it's called The Lanyard, Billy Collins, former Poet Laureate of the U.S. I think that's a poem I would have loved to have written.
If they built a 5th theme park for Disney, where would you want it to be and what type of park?
I would definitely want it to be in California because I'm a little tired of Florida for the time being. A little frustrating place to go right now. No offense to Floridians, it's more your government. But I would love it to be in California, closer to home and not as humid. Tokyo Disney Sea is the most incredible Disney park in the world. I would love it to just be that, because it's incredible. I am a Disney fan, and behind me on my other wall here is all my Disney paraphernalia. On this side, it's poetry collaborations. On that side, it's all Disney related. And I don't care if it's embarrassing and I'm a Disney adult. I wear it proudly.
That's great. What is the title of the poem inspired by you?
He's very tall and tries to avoid hitting his head.
Our last segment is called Question Down the Lane. We ask each guest to provide a question for the next guest.
Is there a secret or piece of wisdom that you could give the rest of us to get everything done in one day that you want to get done?
Get into flow, actually. I think I've thought about this a lot. So I love hiking, and I've hiked Half Dome a few times, and that's a long hike. It can take 8 to 10 hours for an ordinary person. And the first 30 minutes of that, it's Half Dome for context, this is Yosemite, and it's an incredible day hike. The first 30 minutes of any hike is a grind. Your body's warming up, and then you get into flow, and then the hours sort of fall away. The same thing applies with writing. You don't just sit down and start, for the most part, start writing and off you go. You have to grind through about 30 minutes of your brain warming up, just like your body warms up when you're hiking. So it's really important to acknowledge that getting into flow takes time, and that you have to expect the first chunk to always be painful, just like with hiking. So I keep that in mind. If I'm editing, I can go in, dabble, and poke around. But if I really want to write something, I have to factor that time of getting into flow.
Would you mind reading a poem to end the episode?
Yes, and I think I will read a poem that I've referred to and is, I think, the most universal of the poems I've written. This is from my first book, Canvas, with this extraordinary artwork that you mentioned before, and then the originals over on the wall there. Everybody's experienced this unless you're super young, and at that point you will experience it at some point. Crush. Teen week at Foxwood Inn. I'm 15, scrawny, bookwormed and shy. She arrives so tall, her rich brown curls waving a smile, dazzling and confident. The crush envelops me, its weight taking my breath away. As she turns the corner, there is no time to say hi, and I fear being caught staring too long. Each morning after breakfast, I peek over my paperback, waiting for her to pass by, and if her eyes catch mine, I shrink and blush, my heart crushed and racing. Later, by the dock, the jocks show off their running, shirtless, headlong dives, while I sit, silently, on a fading Muskoka chair, tucking my book under a towel, avoiding splashes. When the last night comes, her name a mystery still, with Stairway to Heaven's sorrowful intro begun, I crush fear, walking towards her, extending my hand, offering a dance. She looks me in the eye and quietly nods, no, and takes the dance floor with one of the diving boys. I walk into darkness across dew-damp grass, down to the end of the dock, sitting, legs swinging, toes caressing the still cool lake, Robert Plant echoing in the distance. Between chords, I hear footsteps. She's there, her hand on my shoulder, a tear sliding down my cheek. I like you, James, but just as a friend, sitting down beside me as the song ends. I feel the crush as my imagined first kiss drifts away with the ripples beneath my feet, but in time, smile, eyes closed and dry, replaying her saying my name.
That's very lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
That experience is very positive, and it was a lesson of how to treat people, because she's allowed to say, no, I don't want to dance with you. But the way she did so was very empathetic. The hook to that poem was, how many different ways can I use the word crush? Was sort of the fun, poetic hook.
James, thank you so much for sharing an hour of poetry with us. We really enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you back on.
I should have a very cool book touring all the museums in San Francisco Bay Area through poetry. So yes, I'd love to talk about that in the future.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review and share Podcetera. And be sure to follow and like the series wherever you enjoy podcasts.
For Podcetera, I'm Renee Lego.
And I'm Joelle Ludovich. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.